Hello and welcome back. Let's see here. When last we left Athens, Philip of Macedonia had conquered Athens, or conquered Greece, I should say. Aristotle, who was Philip's friend and the mentor of Philip's son Alexander, fled Athens because he was afraid they'd kill him because of Philip's invasion. Philip himself was assassinated, and Alexander took over. Now, just to put this all in historical perspective again, Socrates was put to death in around 399 BC. So that's the start. That's when Plato left Athens and went traveling. And Alexander took over his father's empire in 323. So that 300, the 4th century BC, was really the sort of era of Plato and Socrates. And now in 323, Alexander takes over. So as we know, he then went on a big tear, conquering things. We'll get to that in a minute. All right, so next, why are we looking at this? What's this interest to us? Well, the center of Greek learning and thought process, the story of the ongoing thought process and development that we're looking at, is going to shift from Athens now over to Alexandria, which is a city in Egypt founded by Alexander. And so the next mathematician we're going to look at is a fellow named Euclid, and Euclid operated out of Alexandria. So that's where we want to get to. We want to talk about Euclid and Alexandria. We're going to tell the story of Alexander the Great, Hellenic world, and how Alexandria got started for Euclid to show up there. So again, what's the context in which Euclid operated? Now, all right, so the world Alexander conquered was called the Hellenistic world. That is because the Greeks did not call themselves Greek, they called themselves Hellenes. And so this means sort of this was the Greek-ish world. It was Greek for hundreds of years before it was conquered in the west by the Romans and in the east by the Parthians. So let's get to that story. All right, so now, as we know, the Greeks and the Persians were always oscillating between either just harassing each other to outright having war with each other. They did not get along. The Greeks were this sort of scrappy little David defending themselves. The Persians was this huge Goliath empire. And the Greeks were pretty successful in continuing to survive in this environment. And Persia was definitely the biggest threat. So Alexander, when he took over, he said, you know what? I am going to drive Persia out of the Greek lands. And everybody thought that sounded like a great idea. So he took off, started to drive them out of the Greek lands. Things got a little out of control, and he found himself in India. Okay, how did that happen? All right, so let's go to the map. Let's look at the story in the map. Yeah, right. So here's the world again. Once again, whoops, oh, no, that's the right thing. Here's Greece, around here. Ooh, green for Greece. Oh, let's get a little bigger brushstroke on that. All right, here's Greece. Now, after Alexander took over, the first thing he did was he went up here and consolidated power in his father's holdings in the Balkans, right? And then remember, these were the Greek lands here in Anatolia. That was the Ionian coast. So he went down there, kicked some Persian butt, went this way and kicked some Persian butt. In 334, at the Battle of Granicus, he defeated him and he was able to take over the city of Sardis. If you recall, Sardis was that city. I had earlier said that when Cyrus the Great took over Sardis, that just opened up all of Anatolia to him. That's when he conquered all of Lydia and took over the Ionian coasts. Well, now it's coming back from the other way. The Greeks come over and take care of and conquer Sardis. So now Alexander pretty much rules all of this area here. Now let's take a moment here to think about what's going on. Notice that, there we go. Notice that there's already more that he said he would do. He'd drive the Persians out of the Greek lands, but he took over that whole area, the old place that used to be Lydia, that was not Greek lands. This got a lot of people nervous because, you know, there's a difference between driving the Goliath out of your lands or fending them off and then actually going after them, going into their lands and starting to take their stuff. And people were very nervous and afraid of this, especially back home. They're like, oh, this is insane. They're just going to kill us dead. Now, Luckily, at the time, Darius III, who was the current ruler of Persia, he was off in the, that would be east, fighting some invaders there. He did not at all expect little Greece to come and invade him, and he was not ready for it, was not prepared for it. So he sent a message back to Alexander. Alexander opened it and read it out to everyone. It said, listen, if you stop your invasion right now, we will let you keep all the lands you've taken without retribution. And everybody thought this was wonderful. This was like winning the lottery, better than they had thought. They were able to keep these lands for themselves and not get crushed by the Persians. Alexander's friend Leonidas said, wow, that's great. I would take that deal. And to which Alexander responded, I would take that deal too, were I Leonidas. However, I am not. I am Alexander. And he ripped the letter up into pieces and tossed it aside and kept going. So that's the kind of guy Alexander was. All right, let's get back to that map again. Okay, what did he do after that? Well, after that, he came down this way and took the Levant, that's sort of the coastal Mideast area here. And then he swung in and conquered Egypt out of the Persians. Since it was conquered by the Persians, you could argue, you could say that he liberated it, but really, he was still controlling it. They weren't ruling themselves. And he was very open-minded. He allowed them to continue their quaint local customs of worshiping their leaders, now him, as gods. That's fine. You want to worship me as a god, go right ahead. He was happy with that. Actually caused some consternation among his people. Remember, these were Greeks. These were, Democrats and all of that, democratic background. They didn't, worship their leaders as gods. But Alexander, very open-minded guy. He was cool with it. Let him do it. Okay, so, and out of that, he basically went this way, took Mesopotamia then, chased Darius III into Persia, kept going that way, beat him a couple times. The last time he fled. In the end, Darius III's people killed him, Darius III, left the body for Alexander, hoping to get some favor that way. Alexander was not happy, but that's that. And his men said, oh my God, this is amazing. We could never believe this happened. Little Greece conquered all of Persia. We now rule the whole known world. This is astounding. Cannot believe what we have accomplished. And Alexander said, you know what? I've heard of this place to the southwest of here, or southeast of here, called India. Let's go conquer that too. So he kept going, and he crossed the river there, and they kept conquering into India. So at which time his men said, okay, wait a minute here. What's exactly the mission? When are we going to stop fighting? Alexander replied, we will stop fighting when we run out of land to take. And they said, finally, no, we did not sign up for this. So let's get out of here. Boom, there we go. We did not sign up for this. And he had, for the first time, some mutiny in his ranks, and then had to turn around and go home. On his way home, he died. And when he was dying, he became sick. His men asked him, okay, who should rule after you? To which Alexander replied, the strongest of you. Whoa, great. That's a recipe for stability. So what happened? All his generals took different lands, and they all started fighting each other to become the ultimate ruler. That did not pan out. In the end, it sort of stayed that there's all these different Greek kingdoms now. Again, I said this was called the Hellenistic world, these different Greek kingdoms. So that's where it stood there. So where are we? Also, once again, to kind of fit this into biblical histories, in the Old Testament, the book of Maccabees are the stories of the sort of Greek resistance, or the Jews' resistance to their Greek leaders at this time. So this is the time period, that's where that fits in. Okay. Now, of course, not for the first time and not for the last. I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent. One of the things I think is the coolest thing I've seen, looking through all this historical stuff, and that is the story of Greek India. So if you recall, I just said Alexander was there conquering northwestern India, and there were Greek states there. And when his generals broke it all up and took states, some of them stayed in that area. First, they were known as the Bactrian Greeks. Bactria is sort of the area around Afghanistan. And then there's the Indo-Greek Empire or the Greco-Indian Empire. I've seen it called both in that area there. But they stayed there for quite some time. And in fact, now, when Americans maybe think of Buddhism, we may think of Japan or China, but Buddhism actually started in India and it spread throughout India. Right after Alexander took this area and he personally left, Chandragupta Maurya went through and conquered the first big Indian empire. So the Greeks were still there, but now Gupta started this big one. This is the Mauryan dynasty, about 300 BC it started, lasted for a few hundred years. The third ruler of that, Gupta's grandson, Ashoka, actually converted to Buddhism. He went around, killed lots and lots of people, conquered lots and lots of stuff, and then sort of felt sorry about it. Looked around and said, oh, maybe I shouldn't have killed all these people. I kind of feel bad about that. Converted to Buddhism, and then really started promoting Buddhism throughout all of India. India could be thought of as a Buddhist nation at that particular point in time. Now, Buddhism did not travel straight from India into China through the Himalayas, but rather swung around the Himalayas, hit the Silk Road, and then migrated into China along the Silk Road. And what did it run into at that point? The Greeks. This means that these Bactrian Greeks or Indo-Greco peoples were Buddhist before Chinese even were. And if you think of the statues you're used to seeing of the Buddha, those are actually Greek. In India, it was not considered right to make images of the Buddha, and so they didn't do that. But once it got to these Greek lands, they had this history of Greek statuary, and so they created, out of that tradition, started creating Buddha statues. So crazy, All right. Back on track. Back to the stuff we're here for. Okay, so Egypt was taken by his general Ptolemy. And that started the Ptolemaic dynasty. Now, the Ptolemies were Greeks. It was a Greek ruling class in Egypt that ruled there all the way up until the Roman Civil War, or maybe I should say one of the Roman Civil Wars. But the Roman Civil War, between Cleopatra and Marcus Antony and Octavian, and there was another guy whose name I can't remember. But anyway, oh, and Cleopatra, let's take a look at this. Perhaps one of the most well-known Egyptians, Cleopatra. Cleopatra is not an Egyptian name. It is a Macedonian name. Alexander had a sister named Cleopatra. So there you go. Okay, where was I? I keep going off on these tangents. Sister named Cleopatra. Okay, oh yes. So after Alexander fell, all of his generals wanted to establish themselves as his successor, as the true heir of Alexander's empire, even though they each only ruled a portion of it. And Ptolemy had a two-part plan. Part one, steal the body. He stole Alexander's body. He attacked the procession, bringing it back home, and took the body, went to Alexandria and set it up in state as the final resting place of Alexander the Great. And part two, he wanted Alexandria to be the cultural successor of Athens. And so he instituted perhaps history's first program of government-funded research. So he set up a, if you will, government-funded research institute. That was called the Museum of Alexandria. You may have heard of the Library of Alexandria. That was the library associated with the museum. And now the word museum is interesting because what does it mean? Museum means temple of the muses. The muses were Greek goddesses of inspiration. So this first sort of, cultural, philosophical, scientific, if you will, research institute was a religious temple. If that seems weird to us, it's just because we're looking back on it from our perspective here. Think back to when I told the story about the American in Paris who thinks good cuisine means McDonald's. You go there and you suddenly find out things aren't the way that you view them at all. And similarly, looking back, we find the Greeks had no problems with religion and philosophy and all that as all one big thing. It was all just part of learning. So let's see. And that goes back to our second video here about the axial age and looking at Greek philosophy as an outgrowth of a religious reform in the axial age, and mathematics as being a very core important part of that reform. Okay, so one of the scholars to take up in Alexandria, one of the first scholars, and perhaps maybe the most well-known, was Euclid. And we're not going to talk about Euclid in this one. I think we've talked pretty much enough by now. But in the next video, we're going to take a look at an ongoing struggle, debate, problem throughout philosophy of mathematics, going from Pythagoras up through Euclid, and then see where Euclid stood on that. And then the video after that, we're going to really start looking at Euclid's own works in its own right, his elements of mathematics, and his axioms, and the infamous fifth axiom, the parallel postulate. Before we go, I just want to point out one more thing is notice once again the center of Greek learning and scholarly activity and philosophy has moved out of Athens, in fact out of mainland Greece. Once again we find the hub of innovation occurring in the sort of culturally mixed area of the Greek-Egyptian lands there. I didn't put that down as one of the themes for our talk, but as I'm giving these talks, this thing just keeps coming up to me more and more often. All right, I think that's it. Thank you again for joining me. Hope to see you for the next video.